what is schizophrenia from your research and from your general understanding, and what is the full landscape of suffering and wisdom that schizophrenia explores?
Schizophrenia is a state where there is a break from reality. And so this can show up as we call them the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. These include hallucinations, hearing something or seeing something that's not there, usually auditory hallucinations. Paranoia, people can have complex fears. Delusions, which we call fixed false beliefs. People get an extremely unshakable but completely implausible idea about something. Sometimes it relates to themselves, sometimes to the world. These we call the positive symptoms, break from reality as we know it. Then there are the negative symptoms that come with it, and these are progressive. These are flattening of emotion, as we call it. So starting to express less and less positive emotion, ending more in a neutral or flat state. Thought disorder, inability to work with complex patterns of planning or thinking. So you can't make plans. You have poor working memory. You can't keep track of where you were in a conversation, in a sequence of actions. So poor and impaired working with the thoughts of oneself, and then these positive symptoms of break from reality. Okay, now why do these come together? What's the neurobiology of it? Again, we don't know. Schizophrenia, extremely genetically determined. If you look at the numbers, could be upwards of 80% genetically determined.
Oh, wow.
1% of the human population around the world. It's universal. Okay, it's not confined to any one culture. Not even really biased in one culture or another. About 1% around the world, and has this progressive quality to it, untreated. So it's very interesting. There's a break that happens. We call it first break, when someone experiences their first disruption of reality. They can have a completely typical life up until that point. So you might have and I've seen, just heartbreaking cases of like this in the Stanford emergency room, where a kid who's come there, who's been extremely high functioning in that sense of academic achievement and athletic and interpersonal, and then comes to college. Usually in men, it's around 18, 19 when the first break happens. Some terrifying paranoia hits or some auditory hallucinations start. They're getting screamed at by a voice in their head. So devastating. With women, comes on also often a little later, sometimes in the 20s. And it can be progressive. If it's not treated, it just progresses and progresses. The voices become overwhelming. The delusions and paranoia extend and expand. The negative symptoms particularly become more and more severe. So one can't even maintain thoughts in any sort of ordered fashion. And then eventually, death, it can be fatal. It can lead to suicide. It can lead to erratic behavior that leads to accidents. Now, it can be treated. There are medications that help. Fortunately, they have side effects, so they're not perfect. You can have movement problems and actually a whole host of different side effects that come from the medications. But we can help people now with schizophrenia very, very significantly. But the amazing thing, and this is emblematic of where psychiatry stands, we don't have the deep understanding. Just like with depression, we don't have that heart as a pump level of understanding that we'd like to have with schizophrenia, despite it being so biological, so genetic in its nature.
So is there a way to return to the other side of the first break? So when you have a break with reality, is there a way to kind of stitch it together?
Yeah. So some people that works, but we don't really know how. So medications, antipsychotic medications, we call them, they block a particular neurotransmitter receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor, and they modulate dopamine as well and other neurotransmitters. These can take someone who's actively hallucinating, actively paranoid, put them back in a completely normal state. And some people stay that way indefinitely. And so you can bring people back from that back to the other side, have it stitched together. More typically, you'll end up in some intermediate state where symptoms are reduced powerfully, but there might be still something there, and you've got a drop down in functioning that may be persistent for a while. But concepts, what physically is going on? One idea is that it's communication within the brain. One part of the brain is not able to tell other parts of the brain what it's doing. And so the auditory hallucinations are very interesting in this regard. They often have this conversational inner monologue-like quality. As we're walking along the street, we may have an inner monologue, thoughts about what's going on. If we see somebody we don't like, we may have a thought, oh, I wish somebody would punch that guy, something like that, or maybe I should punch that guy. But these are so far below where we would ever, act or even think of acting, but they're just things that come up. And in people with schizophrenia, those inner thoughts, that inner monologue is not recognized as the inner monologue of the self. And so it's perceived as something coming from the outside, or from inside, but from another entity.
Another, I thought you meant like another room inside the same building.
Another room in the
inside there, yeah.
Yeah. And so it could be conceptualized as a communication within the brain problem, notifying what's another part of the brain what's going on. And there's some evidence consistent with that.
I don't know if you can help with this, but I've been talking to quite a few homeless folks recently. That's what I do is I hang out at night and talk to interesting people. And some of them, and I've known people in the past who suffer from schizophrenia, and some of them, like self, will describe as something they suffer from, and they seem to understand something deeply about this world. I don't know if it's correlated, or maybe it's another aspect of like depression, all those things that I've encountered in my own life, is maybe just the struggle and the suffering has taken you through a life where you think deeply about life. Like there's like self-reflection that society forces on you because it's a disorder somehow of some kind. It's interesting. I guess my only sort of anecdotal observation is people who suffer from schizophrenia seem to be very interesting and very thoughtful in a nonlinear way about the world.
I've noticed that it's not always positive. The unusual ways they view the world. But it's always interesting.
That could be conspiratorial thinking too.
Yeah.
But the theories they have about the way the world functions, often very well read, which is also interesting, because they're almost like looking for helpful answers from somewhere.
Absolutely, there.
And so they might be citing some very interesting literature and then using that to. There's a stickiness in their mind to different models of the world and trying to make sense of that world. Yes. And those models could include conspiracy theories.
Yeah. They're very attuned to complexity, and they come up with unlikely explanations, which is one of the things that makes it hard for them to function in the world is how unlikely their explanations are. But you're right, there's a depth of consideration of the complexity of the world and a concern about it, and an impulse to work to understand it that is actually quite refreshing. But the first case in the medical literature, there was the classical schizophrenia. There was a patient named James Tilly Matthews who had this. He sketched out for his doctor the experiences he was sensing, and he drew himself as a cowering figure on the ground, controlled by a loom, a weaving device that was sending long threads, projections across space from the loom to him, to his arms and to his body, and controlling him from afar. And he called this the air loom, a loom in the air. And it was such an evocative thing because, this was the start of the Industrial Revolution or mid, and it was where, really industrial strength, looms and weaving devices were really kind of the emblematic of the most complex, powerful technological achievements of the time. And so that was the explanation available to him to explain how his body was seemingly moved without his volition. And these days, of course, people with schizophrenia will have more technology appropriate interpretations. They'll have delusions of satellite or alien control or beamed information. Very, very common to have this delusion of a government agency, sending electromagnetic or radio frequency information to control their limbs. But it's the same thing. It's that whether it's a thread from an industrial revolution loom or, RF, radiation, it's the same thing, just adapted to the moment, trying to explain the world they live in and their relationship to the world.
But unconstrained by sort of the thing that's socially acceptable, which is
that's right.
Both refreshing and dangerous.
Yes.